Hello, I'm Dave Seyfert, and I have the privilege of interviewing Reverend Dr. James W. White, Pastor Emeritus, who served as senior minister at FCC from 1989 to 2005. I've known Jim since I had the honor of serving on the search committee that called him to First Congregational. Jim, we appreciate your sharing some thoughts and memories with us today.
Happy to be here.
Maybe we could start with your telling us what led you to accept that call to First Congregational, what appealed to you about this opportunity, and some of your first impressions.
As a child, I lived up in Cascade, Colorado during the summertime, coming out from Oklahoma. And we'd come to town, and I'm sure that I saw this building when I came to town. So I knew about this, and when I moved here from Yale Divinity School in 1962, was aware of the church, and sometime along that time, Jerry Jordan was called, and I knew Jerry, and I worked with Jerry on some committee meetings of the conference, and with Faye Gallegos, who was his associate in Christian education. And so I thought rather highly of this church, and of course it was in the great location in Colorado, near, not only an hour away from the South Platte River.
And you mentioned Jerry Jordan. I remember Jerry telling me when you were called and you were coming here that he knew you, and it was said that you and Jerry were both cut from the same clod of Oklahoma clay.
Red clay, yes. Both of us born in 1937.
So you were well known for the pride that you took in crafting a good sermon. And you spoke from memory without notes, which was quite impressive to us. Can you tell us about what went into crafting and delivering a meaningful sermon?
I think so. I wanted always a sermon that was theologically sound. That is, that didn't want to just talk about social issues or something else. I always wanted to have some reference to the whatever's happening in culture. I wanted a sermon that appealed to the person individually. I usually wanted to have something that was humorous, that could entertain a little bit, and be faithful to the tradition. I think I ended every sermon saying, "Let the people say amen," and people were pretty responsive about that. I felt really good about my sermons. I always had a complete manuscript, but it always stayed on the pulpit if I would be out in front of the congregation speaking. So I didn't memorize the sermons so much as I learned them and tried to then communicate by eye contact with the congregation. It was, I think, generally appreciated very much.
Definitely. Another thing you're remembered for is your annual fishing retreats. Are there any memories or fish stories that you'd like to share?
Gosh, when I came here, I found some guys that were fishermen. And so we began to do retreats up on the Laramie River, and a number of people went with me there. And I continued that at different locations through the years. And after I retired in 2005, shortly thereafter, whenever I came from banishment from being away for 2 years, I started doing some spirituality and fly fishing retreats and did those for half a dozen or more years. So I've had a lot of chances to be with people on the river or on the lakes, and it was always a treat to be with folks. We would often do contemplative practices on the fishing retreats that I did with people, because watching the bobber and staying in meditative, contemplative state, I always thought was pretty similar. A number of people had caught fish with me when I took them, and that was always something that they very much enjoyed, and I enjoyed doing that.
We also recall your emphasis on education and intellectual stimulation. You're an author, you're an engaging speaker, and a frequent contributor to the forum. Could you share how you viewed the role of education in your ministry?
When I finished doctoral work at the University of Denver, I was eventually called to be the teaching minister at First Plymouth Church in Denver. And so I always thought that that was a very important thing to do. So I did a lot of work with adult education there, as well as with confirmation education. So I've always thought that one is ordained often as pastor and teacher. And so I always wanted to sort of emphasize that teacher aspect of the ministry. And that's partly why I'm so honored to have had a lectureship put out in my name after I've retired, which brought into Colorado Springs to this church some great speakers like John Shelby Spong and Walter Brueggemann, Diana Butler Bass most recently, I forgot his last name, Dominic Crossan, Joan Chittister, others. So that particular teaching job of the pastor I felt was important, and I'm so glad that we could have great intellectual stimulation through the years like you did in the adult forum here at the church for 20 plus years, and has continued even to this very day.
One of the most challenging times for First Congregational that occurred during your tenure involved the fallout from Amendment 2 in Colorado in 1992, which prevented anti-discrimination laws protecting LGBTQ rights, and which was later ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. It was a divisive time for our church, and you demonstrated great courage, Jim, in your leadership by opposing Amendment 2. You were known for a rather memorable answer you gave during an interview with Bill Moyers. I take the Bible too seriously to take it literally. Could you talk about this period of time during your ministry?
Sure. I'll need to talk about the Bill Moyers interview. After I said that, Bill Moyers, who was sitting across the pews from me in the sanctuary on the east side, said, well, up at Colorado University, Coach Bill McCartney has quoted the Leviticus where it says, it is abomination in the eyes of the Lord for a man to lie with another man. And I said, that is certainly in the Bible. But the problem is that Coach McCartney is going to read a little further in Leviticus where it says, it is an abomination in the eyes of the Lord to touch the skin of a dead pig, and that'll be the end of football at CU. Well, that particular quotation in the Bill Moyers' New Holy Wars video went viral, and I got hundreds of letters from people really around the world about that. And lots of people saw that interview, and people began to come to this church who had seen the interview. So for, 5 or 6 years afterwards, every new member class that we had, there'd be somebody who said, well, I first learned about you in First Plymouth, First Congregational, on the Bill Moyers show. So it had a lot of positive repercussions for the church, which is not to say that it wasn't controversial. Oh my goodness. We struggled with it, as you may remember. There were people that left the church, not large numbers, but some. And I do know that there was one fellow in the church, for whatever reasons I could never find out why, would leave the church every time I got up to preach here at First Congregational. In any case, the issue arose And I was interested in saying that gay and lesbian people shouldn't be discriminated against. And in, I think, about 1992 or 3, I went down to the city hall with a member, Van Shaw, and said, the United Church of Christ believes that there shouldn't be discrimination against gay and lesbian people. And it was a packed house down there with almost an angry mob. But I just have always thought that acceptance of people on the basis of their sexuality was a slam dunk issue. I didn't think it was particularly controversial. And I still think that in terms of the gospel, that acceptance is part of what churches ought to be about.
We'll let the people say amen. And somewhere along the way, Jim, you met a very special person here who became your wife and really your partner in ministry in many ways. Talk about Patti.
Patti, the omnicompetent, indefatigable woman? Yes, I think so. I met her when I was first introduced to the church here in 1989. And the conference minister said, don't get involved with anybody in the church. And I tried not to, but she was irresistible. So we had a kind of on and off again relationship for a year or so. But on the 1st of December, the beginning of Advent, 1991, we were married in the sanctuary in front of, as Patti says, in front of 450 of our closest friends and family. And we've been married now, we're 30 years. And Patti, among other things, brought to the church the first madrigal dinner in '88. And we continue that in '89 and off and on for now more than 30 years. And that's one of the great things that she does. And she's often doing the catering for events here, for weddings, for funerals, for special occasions, providing food and hospitality. She always said that our home should be a home of hospitality, and it has been, so that every year after Christmas and around New Year's, we would do an open house at 704 North Walnut. And in 2-hour blocks, we'd have the whole congregation come over and spend some time with us. So that's a little bit about Patti Girl.
It's been a good match, hasn't it?
It's been, I didn't know marriage could be so good.
So what advice do you have for First Congregational as we look forward to our next 150 years?
Well, I think that we need to continue to be a progressive church. In looking over the history of the church, I know that, for example, in the 1800s, when evolution was under consideration and the findings in geology were going on, this church was open to it. So it's always had a close connection with Colorado College, but many of the thinkers in Colorado College were members of this church, as they are today. So I would hope that our church would continue to stay on the progressive, educative track with the times. And I think that that's why today we're considered probably the most progressive church in Colorado Springs.
Okay. Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share with us today?
Oh, probably a good number of them. I'm not sure where to begin. I look back on my time here as one in which not just the teaching ministry and the preaching ministry were there, but we've always been people that cared for one another, as witnessed by the contemporary Stephen ministry and people that we've hired. I never was particularly interested in doing pastoral counseling, which has been some clergy person's forte. But I do think that one of my gifts was organization. And a lot of positive things happened because I encouraged things to happen, including, for example, the first year that I was here, the first summer, you and I and some other people that had what Patti calls the velvet voices started a folk music service. We started a jazz Sunday. Both of those have continued. We have continued with other things such as the Palm Sunday, Crucifixion Friday service, which I think to me is one of my most favorite Sundays of the year, when the interpretive dancers come down the middle section of the church with that large sheer drape that touches people's heads and brings it up to the front and wraps the church front in the cloth. And you guys would sing, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" That was a great, great service. There's been other ones that I can recall, and great people that have filled the pulpit. One of the things that I loved at our 125th anniversary was we were able to bring back former pastors, McDowell, Joe Carroll, Jerry Jordan, I forgot, a couple others, and sort of help us be connected. When Ed Manthei was here, I remember him saying, I think, did he preach my installation service? I think so. And he was able to say, Sister Carrie used to sit over there, and Mr. and Mrs. so-and-so were over there. And he had this great memory. And we, by the way, have had some terrific clergy that have been here. One of them was Ed Manthei, who became president of Chicago Theological Seminary. Another was Daniel Day Williams, one of America's best theologians, who ended up teaching at Union Seminary and taught Jerry Jordan. As a little aside, and this has to do probably with the educational valuing of this church. For a time, the pastors of this church came from Yale, where I came from Union, where Jerry came from, and from Harvard, where Ben Broadbent came from. So we have this history of calling significantly educated clergy.
Jim, thanks for sharing these thoughts and memories with us as we celebrate our 150th anniversary.
It's a pleasure to do this. I thank you for the time. And I have, by the way, somewhere, some notes that I made in the last couple of days that I'll pass on to the committee that would fill in some of the things I said, as well as other things that you might want to look at as you proceed with these interviews. But thanks, David, and thank you, folks, for this time.
Thank you.